Welcome back as I continue to read Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief. Chapter 6. I became Supreme Lord of the Bathroom. Once I got over the fact that my Latin teacher was a horse, we had a nice tour, though I was careful not to walk behind him. We passed the volleyball pit. Several of the campers nudged each other. One pointed to the Minotaur horn he was carrying. Another said, "That's him." Most of the campers were older than me. Their satyr friends were bigger than Grover, all of them trotting around in orange Camp Half-Blood t-shirts with nothing else to cover their bare, shaggy hindquarters. I wasn't normally shy, but the way they stared at me made me uncomfortable. I felt like they were expecting me to do a flip or something. I looked back at the farmhouse. It was a lot bigger than I realized. 4 stories tall, sky blue with white trim, like an upscale seaside resort. I was checking out the brass eagle weather vane on top when something caught my eye. A shadow in the uppermost window of the attic gable. Something had moved the curtain, just for a second, and I got the distinct impression I was being watched. "What's up there?" I asked Sharon. He looked where I was pointing and smiled, and his smile faded. "Just the attic." "Somebody lives there?" "No," he said with finality. "Not a single living thing." I got the feeling he was being truthful, but I was also sure something had moved the curtain. "Come along, Percy," Charon said, his light-hearted tone now a little forced. "Lots to see." We walked through the strawberry fields where campers were picking bushels of berries while a satyr played a tune on a reed pipe. Charon told me that the camp grew a nice crop for exports to New York restaurants and Mount Olympus. "It pays our expenses," he explained, "and the strawberries take almost no effort." He said Mr. D had this effect on fruit-bearing plants. They just went crazy when he was around. It worked best with wine grapes, but Mr. D was restricted from growing those, so they grew strawberries instead. I watched as the satyr began playing his pipe. His music was causing lines of bugs to leave the strawberry patch in every direction, like refugees fleeing from a fire. I wondered if Grover could work that kind of magic with music. I wondered if he was still inside the farmhouse, getting chewed out by Mr. D. "Grover won't be getting in too much trouble, will he?" I asked Chiron. "I mean, he was a good protector, really." Chiron sighed. He shed his tweed jacket and it draped over his horse back like a saddle. "Grover has big dreams, Percy. Perhaps bigger than reasonable. To reach his goal, he must first demonstrate great courage by succeeding as a keeper, finding a new camper, and bringing him safely to Half-Blood Hill." "But he did that." "I might agree with you," Chiron said, "but it's not my place to judge. Dionysus and the Council of Coven Elders must decide, and I'm afraid they might not see this assignment as successful. After all, Grover lost you in New York, then there's the unfortunate fate of your mother, and the fact that Grover was unconscious when you dragged him over the property line. The council might question whether this shows any courage on Grover's part." I wanted to protest. None of what happened was Grover's fault. Also, I felt really, really guilty. If I hadn't given Grover the slip at the bus station, he might not have gotten into trouble. "He'll get a second chance, won't he?" Chiron winced. "I'm afraid that was Grover's second chance, Percy. The council was not anxious to give him another either after what happened the first time, 5 years ago. Olympus knows. I advised him to wait longer before he tried again. He is still so small for his age." "How old is he?" "Oh, 28. "What? And he's in 6th grade? Satyrs mature half as fast as humans, Percy. Grover's been the equivalent of middle school student for the past 6 years. That's horrible. Quite, Chiron agreed. At any rate, Grover is a late bloomer, even by satyr standards, and not yet very accomplished at woodland magic. Alas, he was very anxious to pursue his dream. Perhaps now he'll have to find some other career. That's not fair, I said. What happened the first time? Was it really so bad? Chiron looked away quickly. Let's move along, shall we? But I wasn't quite ready to let the subject drop. Something had occurred to me when Chiron talked about my mother's fate, as if he were intentionally avoiding the word death. The beginning of an idea, a tiny, hopeful fire, started forming in my mind. Chiron, I said, if the gods and Olympius and all that are real. Yes. Does that mean the underworld is real too? Chiron's expression darkened. Yes, child. He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. There's a place where spirits go after death. But for now, until we know more, I would urge you to put that out of your mind. What do you mean, until we know more? Come, Percy, let's see the woods. As we got closer, I realized how huge the forest was. It took up at least a quarter of the valley, with trees so tall and thick, you could imagine nobody's been there since the Native Americans. Chiron said, The woods are stocked, if you care to try your luck, but go armed. Stocked with what? I asked. Armed with what? You'll see. Capture the flag, it's Friday night. Do you have your own sword and shield? My own? No, Chiron said. I don't suppose you do. I think a size 5 will do. We'll visit the armory later. I wanted to ask what kind of summer camp had an armory, but there was too much else to think about, so the tour continued. We saw the archery range, the canoeing lake, the stables, which Chiron didn't seem to like very much, the javelin range, the sing-along amphitheater, and the arena where Chiron said they held sword and spear fights. Sword and spear fights? I asked. Cabin challenges and all that, he explained. Not lethal, usually. Oh, and there's the mess hall. Chiron pointed to an outdoor pavilion framed in white Greek columns on a hill overlooking the sea. There was a dozen stone picnic tables. No roof, no walls. What do you do when it rains? I asked. Chiron looked at me as if I had gone a little weird. We still have to eat, don't we? I decided to drop the subject. Finally, he showed me the cabins. There were 12 of them, nestled in the woods by the lake. They were arranged in a U, with 2 at the base and 5 rows on either side. They were without the doubt the most bizarre collection of buildings I've ever seen, except for the fact that each had a large brass number above their door, odds on the left, evens on the right. They looked absolutely nothing alike. Number 9 had smokestacks, like a tiny factory. Number 4 had tomato vines on the wall, and the roof made out of real glass. 7 seemed to be made of solid gold, which gleamed so much in the sunlight it was almost impossible to look at. They all faced a commons area about the size of a soccer field, dotted with Greek statues, fountains, flower bed, and a couple of basketball hoops, which were more my speed. In the center of the field was a huge stone-lined fire pit. Even though it was a warm afternoon, the hearth smoldered. A girl, about 9 years old, was tending to the flames, poking the coals with a stick. The pair of cabins at the head of the field, numbers 1 and 2, looked like his and hers mausoleums, big white marble boxes with heavy columns in front. Cabin 1 was the biggest and the bulkiest of the 12. Its polished bronze doors shimmered like a hologram, so that from different angles, lightning bolts seemed to streak across them. Cabin 2 was more graceful somehow, with slimmer columns, garlanded with pomegranates and flowers. The walls were carved with images of peacocks. Zeus and Hera, I guessed. Correct, Chiron said. Their cabins look empty. Several of the cabins are, that's true. No one ever stays in one or two. Okay, so each cabin had a different god, like a mascot. 12 cabins for the 12 Olympians. But why would some be empty? I stopped in front of the first cabin on the left, cabin 3. It wasn't high and mighty like cabin 1, but long and solid. The outer walls were rough gray stone, studded with pieces of seashell and coral, as if the slabs had been hewn straight from the bottom of the ocean floor. I peeked inside the open doorway, and Chiron said, "Oh, I wouldn't do that." Before I could pull me back, I caught the salty scents of the interior, like wind on the shore of Montauk. The interior walls glowed like Ablon. There were 6 empty bunk beds with silk sheets turned down, but there was no sign of anyone had ever slept there. The place felt so sad and lonely. I was glad when Chiron put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Come along, Percy." Most of the other cabins were crowded with campers. Number 5 was bright red, a real nasty paint job. It's as if the color had been splashed on with buckets and fist. The roof was lined with barbed wire. A stuffed boar head was hung inside the doorway. Its eyes seemed to follow me. Inside, I could see a bunch of mean-looking kids, both girls and boys, arm wrestling and arguing with each other while rock music blared. The loudest was a girl, maybe 13 or 14. She wore a size XXXL Camp Half-Blood t-shirt under a camouflage jacket. She zeroed in on me and gave me an evil stare. She reminded me of Nancy Beaufort, though the camper girl was much bigger and tougher looking, and her hair was long and stringy and brown instead of red. I kept walking, trying to stay clear of Chiron's hooves. We haven't seen any other centaurs," I observed. "No," said Chiron sadly. "My kingsmen are wild and barbaric folk, I'm afraid. You might encounter them in the wilderness or major sporting events, but you won't see any here." "You said your name was Chiron. Are you really?" He smiled down at me. "The Chiron from the stories? Trainer of Hercules and all that?" "Yes, Percy, I am." "But shouldn't you be dead?" Chiron paused as if the question intrigued him. "I honestly don't know about should be. The truth is I can't be dead. You see, eons ago the gods granted my wish. I could continue to work the work I loved. I could be a teacher of heroes as long as humanity needed me. I gained much from that wish. And I gave up much, but I'm still here, so I can only assume I'm still needed. I thought about being a teacher for 3,000 years. It wouldn't have made my list of top 10 things to wish for." "Does it ever get boring?" No, he said. "Horribly depressing at times, but never boring." "Why depressing?" Chiron seemed to turn hard of hearing again. "Oh, look," he said. "Annabeth's waiting for us." The blonde girl I'd met at the big house was reading a book in front of the last cabin on the left, number 11. When we reached her, she looked over me critically, like she was thinking about how much I drooled. I tried to see what she was reading, but I couldn't make out the title. I thought my dyslexia was acting up, but then I realized the title wasn't even English. The letters looked Greek to me, and I mean literally Greek. They were pictures of temples and statues and different kinds of columns, like those in an architecture book. "Annabeth," Chiron said, "I have master's archery class at noon. Can you take Percy from here?" "Yes, sir." "Cabin 11, Chiron told me, gesturing towards the doorway. "Make yourself at home." Out of all the cabins, 11 looked like the most regular summer camp cabin, with the emphasis on the old. The threshold was worn down, with brown paint peeling. Over the doorway was one of those doctor symbols, a winged pole with the 2 snakes wrapped around it. What did they call it? Catechus? Inside, it was packed with people, both boys and girls. way more than the number of bunk beds. Sleeping bags were spread all over the floors. It looked like a gym where the Red Cross had set up an evacuation center. Chiron didn't go in. The door was too low for him, but when the campers saw him, they all stood and bowed respectfully. "Well then," Chiron said, "good luck, Percy. I'll see you at dinner." He galloped away towards the archery range. I stood in the doorway looking at the kids. They weren't bowing anymore. They were staring at me, sizing me up. I knew this routine. I'd gone through it in enough schools. "Well?" Annabeth prompted. "Go on." So naturally I tripped coming in the door and made a total fool of myself. There were some snickers from the campers, but none of them said anything. Annabeth announced, "Percy Jackson, meet Cabin 11. "Regular or undetermined?" somebody said. I didn't know what to say, but Annabeth said, "Undetermined." Everybody groaned. A guy who was a little older than the rest came forward. "Now, campers, this is what we're here for. Welcome, Percy. You can have a spot on the floor, right there." The guy was about 19. He looked pretty cool. He was tall and muscular, with short cropped sandy hair and a friendly smile. He wore an orange tank top, cut-off sandals, and a leather necklace made with 5 different colored clay beads. The only thing unsettling about his appearance was a thick white scar that ran just beneath his right eye to his jaw, like an old knife slash. "This is Luke," Annabeth said. Her voice sounded different. I glanced over her and I could have sworn she was blushing. She saw me looking, and her expression hardened again. "He's your counselor for now." "For now?" I asked. "You're undetermined," Luke explained patiently. "They don't know what cabin to put you in, so you're here. Cabin 11 takes all the newcomers, all visitors. Naturally we would. Hermes is our patron, the god of travelers." I looked at the tiny section of floor they'd given me. I had nothing to put there to mark it as my own. No luggage, no clothes, no sleeping bag, just the Minotaur horn. I thought about setting that down, but I remembered that Hermes was also the god of thieves. I looked around at the campers' faces, some sullen and suspicious, some grinning stupidly, some eyeing me as if they were waiting a chance to pick my pockets. "How long will I be here?" I asked. "Good question," Luke said. Until you're determined." "How long will that take?" All the campers laughed. "Come on," Annabeth told me. "I'll show you the volleyball court." "I've already seen it." "Come on." She grabbed my wrist and dragged me outside. I could hear the kids of Cabin 11 laughing behind me. When we were a few feet away, Annabeth said, "Jackson, you have to do better than that." "What?" She rolled her eyes and mumbled under her breath, "I can't believe I thought you were the one." "What's your problem?" I was getting angry now. "All I know is that I killed some bull guy." "Don't talk like that," Annabeth told me. "Do you know how many kids at this camp wish they had your chance to get killed? To fight the Minotaur? What do you think we trained for?" I shook my head. "Look, if the thing I fought really was the Minotaur, the same one in all those stories, yes, then there's only one. Yes, and he died like a gajillion years ago, right? Theseus killed him in the labyrinth, so monsters don't die, Percy. They can be killed, but they don't die." "Oh, thanks. That cleared that up. They don't have souls like you and me. You can be dispelled from them for a while. Maybe even from a whole lifetime if you're lucky. But they are primal forces. Chiron calls them archetypes. Eventually, they'll reform." I thought about Mrs. Dodds. "You mean if I killed one accidentally with a sword?" I mean your math teacher." "That's right. She's still out there. And you just made her very, very mad." "How do you know about Miss Dodds?" "You talk in your sleep. You almost called her something. A fury. They're Hades' torturers, right?" Annabeth glanced nervously at the ground, as if she expected it to open up and swallow her. You shouldn't call them by name. Even here, we call them the kindly ones, if we have to speak of them at all. Look, is there anything we can say without it thundering? I sounded whiny, even to myself, but right then I didn't care. Why do I have to stay in cabin 11 anyways? Why is everybody so crowded together? There are plenty of empty bunks right over there. I pointed at the first few cabins, and Annabeth turned pale. You don't just choose a cabin, Percy. It depends on who your parents are. Or your parent. She stared at me, waiting for me to get it. My mom is Sally Jackson, I said. She works at the candy store in Grand Central Station. At least she used to. I'm sorry about your mom, Percy, but that's not what I mean. I'm talking about your other parent. Your dad. He's dead. I never knew him. Annabeth sighed. Clearly she'd had this conversation with other kids before. Your father's not dead, Percy. How can you say that? You know him? No, of course not. Then how can you say, because I know you? You wouldn't be here if you weren't one of us. You don't know anything about me. No? She raised an eyebrow. I bet you moved around from school to school. I bet you were kicked out of a lot of them. Oh, diagnosed with dyslexia? Probably ADHD too? I tried to swallow my embarrassment. What does that have to do with anything? Taken together, it's almost a sure sign. The letters float off the page when you read, right? That's because your mind is hardwired for ancient Greek. And the ADHD, your impulse, you can't sit still in a classroom, that's your battlefield reflexes. In a real fight, they'll keep you alive. And as for the attention problems, that's because you see too much, Percy, not too little. Your senses are better than a regular mortal's. And of course the teachers want you medicated. Most of them are monsters. They don't want you just seeing them for what they are. You sound like you went through the same thing. Most of the kids here did. And if you weren't like us, you couldn't have survived the Minotaur, much less the ambrosia and nectar. Ambrosia and nectar? The food and drink we were giving you to make you better. The stuff that would have killed a normal kid. It would have turned your blood fire and your bones to sand, and you'd be dead. Face it. You're a half-blood. A half-blood. I was reeling with so many questions I didn't know where to start. Then a husky voice yelled, "Well, a newbie!" I looked over. A girl from the big, ugly red cabin was sauntering towards us. She had 3 other girls behind her, all big and ugly and mean like her, wearing camo jackets. Clarice, Annabeth sighed, why don't you go polish your spear or something? Sure, Miss Princess, the big girl said, so I can run it through you Friday night. Kann, Annabeth said, which I somehow understood was Greek for go to the crows. I had a feeling it was a worse curse than it sounded. You don't stand a chance. We'll pulverize you, Clarice said, but her eye twitched. Perhaps she wasn't so sure she could follow through with the threat. She turned to me. Who's this little runt? Percy Jackson, Annabeth said. Meet Clarice, daughter of Ares. I blinked. Like the war god? Clarice sneered. You got a problem with that? No, I said, recovering my wits. It explains the bad smell. Clarice growled. We've got an initiation ceremony for newbies, Percy, whatever. Come on, I'll show you. Clarice, Annabeth tried to stay. Stay out of it, wise girl. Annabeth looked pained, but she did stay out of it, and I didn't really want her help. I was the new kid. I had to earn my own rep. I handed Annabeth my Minotaur horn and got ready to fight, but before I knew it, Clarice had me by the neck and was dragging me towards the cinder block building that I knew immediately was the bathroom. I was kicking and punching. I'd been in plenty of fights before, but this big girl, Clarice, had her hands like iron. She dragged me to the girls' bathroom. There was a line of toilets on one side and a shower stalls down on the other. It smelled like any public bathroom, and I was thinking, as much as I could think with Clarice ripping my hair out, that if this place belonged to the gods, they should have been able to afford classier toilets. Clarice and her friends were laughing, and I was trying to find the strength that I'd used to fight the Minotaur, but it just wasn't there. Like he's big 3 material, Clarice said as she pushed me towards the toilets. Yeah, right. Minotaur probably fell over laughing, he was so stupid looking. Her friends snickered. Annabeth stood in the corner, watching through her fingers. Clarice bent me over my knee and started pushing my head towards the bowl. It reeked like rusted pipes and, well, what goes into toilets. I strained to keep my head up. I was looking at the scummy water, thinking, I won't go into it. I won't. Then something happened. I felt a tug in the pit of my stomach. I heard the plumbing rumble and the pipes shudder. Clarice's grip on my hair loosened. Water shot out of the toilet, making an arc straight over my head, and the next thing I knew, I was sprawled on the bathroom tiles with Clarice screaming behind me. I turned, just as the water blasted again, hitting Clarice straight in the face so hard it pushed her onto her butt. Water stayed on her like the spray from a fire hose, pushing her backward into a shower stall. She struggled, gasping, and her friends started coming toward her, but then the other toilets exploded too, and 6 more streams of water blasted them back. The showers acted up too, and altogether the fixtures sprayed the camouflage girl right out of the bathroom, spinning them around like pieces of garbage being washed away. As soon as they were out of the door, I felt a tug on my gut lessen. The water shut off, and as quickly as it had started. The entire bathroom was flooded. Annabeth hadn't been spared. She was dripping wet, but she hadn't been pushed out the door. She was standing in exactly the same place, staring at me in shock. I looked down, and I realized I was sitting in the only dry spot in the whole room. There was a circle of dry floor around me. I didn't have 1 drop of water on my clothes. Nothing. I stood up, my legs shaky. Annabeth said, "How did you—" "I don't know." We walked to the door. Outside, Clarice and her friends were sprawled in the mud, and a bunch of other campers had gathered around to gawk. Clarice's hair was flattened across her face. Her jacket was sopping and she smelled like sewage. She gave me the look of absolute hatred. "You are dead, new boy. You're totally dead." I probably should have let it go, but I said, "You want me to gargle you with toilet water again, Clarice? Close your mouth." Her friends had to hold her back. They dragged her toward cabin 5, while the other campers made their way to avoid her flailing feet. Annabeth stared at me. I couldn't tell whether she was grossed out or angry at me for dousing her. "What?" I demanded. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," she said, "that I want you on my team for Capture the Flag." That was the end of Chapter 6. Now let's continue with Chapter 7. Word of the bathroom incident spread immediately. Wherever I went, campers pointed at me and muttered something about toilet water, or maybe they were just staring at Annabeth, who was still pretty much dripping wet. She showed me a few more places: the metal shop, where the kids were forging their own swords, an arts and craft room, where satyrs were sandblasting giant marble statues of a goat man, and the climbing wall, which actually consisted of 2 facing walls that shook violently, dropped boulders, sprayed lava, and clashed together if you didn't get to the top fast enough. Finally, we returned to the canoeing lake, where the trail led back to the cabins. "I've got training to do," Annabeth said flatly. "Dinner's at 7:30. Just follow your cabin to the mess hall." "Annabeth, I'm sorry about the toilets." "Whatever. It wasn't my fault." She looked at me skeptically, and I realized it was my fault. I'd made water shoot out of the bathroom fixtures. I didn't understand how, but the toilets had responded to me. I had become one with the plumbing. "You need to talk to the Oracle," Annabeth said. "Who?" "Not who. What?" The oracle. I'll ask Chiron. I stared into the lake, wishing somebody would give me a straight answer for once. I wasn't expecting anybody to be looking back at me from the bottom, but my heart skipped a beat when I noticed two teenage girls sitting cross-legged at the base of the pier, about 20 feet below. They wore blue jeans and shimmering green t-shirts, and their brown hair floated loose around their shoulders as minnows darted in and out. They smiled and waved as if I were a long-lost friend. I didn't know what to do, so I waved back. Don't encourage them, Annabeth warned. Naiads are terrible flirts. Naiads, I repeated, feeling completely overwhelmed. That's it. I want to go home now. Annabeth frowned. Don't you get it, Percy? You are home. This is the only safe place on Earth for kids like us. You mean mentally disturbed kids? I mean not human. Not totally human, anyways. Half human. Half human and half what? I think you know. I didn't want to admit it, but I was afraid if I did. I felt a tingling on my limbs, a sensation I'd sometimes felt when my mom talked about my dad. God, I said. Half God. Annabeth nodded. Your father isn't dead, Percy. He's one of the Olympians. That's crazy. It is? What? The most common things God did in the old stories. They ran around falling in love with humans and having kids with them. Do you think they've changed their habits in the last few millennia? But those are just, I almost said myths again. But then I remember Chiron's warning that in 2,000 years I might be considered a myth. But if all the kids here are half God, demigods, Annabeth said, that's the official term, or half-blood, then who's your dad? My dad's a professor at West Point, she said. I haven't seen him since I was really small. He teaches American history. He's human. What? You assume it has to be male gods who find human females attractive? How sexist is that? Who's your mom, then? Cabin 6. Meaning? Annabeth straightened. Athena, goddess of wisdom and battle. Okay, I thought. Why not? And my dad? Undetermined, Annabeth said. Like I told you. Nobody knows. Except my mother. She knew. Maybe not, Percy. Gods don't always reveal their identities. My dad would have. He loved her. Annabeth gave me a cautious look. She didn't want to burst my bubble. Maybe. Maybe you're right. Maybe he'll send a sign. That's the only way to know for sure is your father to send you a sign claiming you as his son. Sometimes it happens. You mean sometimes it doesn't? Annabeth ran her palm along the rail. The gods are busy. They have a lot of kids who don't always... Well, sometimes they don't care about us, Percy. They ignore us. I thought about some of the kids I'd seen in the Hermes cabin. Teenagers who looked sullen and depressed, as if they're still waiting for a call that would never come. I'd known kids like that at Yancey Academy, shuffled off to boarding school by rich parents who didn't have the time to deal with them. But the gods should have behaved better. And so I'm stuck here, I said. That's it, for the rest of my life. It depends, Annabeth said. Some campers only stay through the summer. If you're a child of Aphrodite or Demeter, you're probably not a real powerful force. The monsters might ignore you, so you can get away with a few months of the summer training and live in the mortal world for the rest of the years. But some of us, it's too dangerous to leave. We're year-rounders. In the mortal world, we attract monsters. They sense us. They come to challenge us. And most of the time, you'll ignore us until we're old enough to cause trouble. About 10 or 12. But after that, most demigods are either make their way here or they get killed off. A few manage to survive in the outside world and become famous. Believe me, if I told you the names, you'd know some of them. Some don't even realize they're demigods. But very, very few of them are like that. So, monsters can't get in here? Annabeth shook her head. Not unless they're intentionally stalked in the woods or specially summoned by somebody on the inside. Why would somebody want to summon a monster? Practice fights? Practical jokes? Practical jokes? The point is, the borders are sealed to keep mortals and monsters out. From the outside, mortals look into the valley and see nothing but strawberry farms. So you're a year-rounder? Annabeth nodded. From under the collar of her t-shirt, she pulled a leather necklace with 5 clay beads of different colors, just like Luke's, except Annabeth also had a huge gold ring strung on it, like a college ring. I've been here since I was 7, she said. Every August, on the last day of summer season, you get a bead for surviving another year. I've been here longer than most of the counselors, and they're all in college. Why'd you come so young? She twisted the ring on her necklace. None of your business. Oh. I stood there in silent uncomfortableness. So, I could just walk out of here right now if I wanted to. It would be suicide, but you could, with Mr. D or Charon's permission. But they wouldn't give permission until the end of the summer season, unless you're granted a quest. But that hardly ever happens. The last time. Her voice trailed off. I could see from her tone that the last time hadn't gone so well. Back in the sick room, I said, when you were feeding me that stuff. Ambrosia? Yeah. You asked me something about the summer solstice. Annabeth's shoulders tensed. So you do know something. Well, no. Back at my old school, I overheard Grover and Chiron talking about it. Grover mentioned the summer solstice, and he said something that we didn't have much time because of the deadline. What did that mean? She clenched her fist. I wish I knew. Chiron and the satyrs, they know, but they won't tell me. Something's wrong in Olympias. Something pretty major. Last time I was there, everything seemed so normal. You've been to Olympias? Some of us year-rounders, like Luke and Clarice and I and a few others, we took a field trip during the winter solstice. That's when the gods have their big annual council. But how did you get there? The Long Island Railroad, of course. You get off at Penn Station, Empire State Building, a special elevator to the 600th floor. She looked at me like she was sure I knew this already. You are in New York, all right? Oh, sure. As far as I knew, there were only 102 floors in the Empire State Building, but I decided not to point that out. Right after we visited, Annabeth continued, the weather got weird. It's as if the gods had started fighting. A couple of times since, I'd overheard satyrs talking. The best I can figure out was something important was stolen, and if it isn't returned by the summer solstice, there's going to be trouble. When you came, I was helping. Athena can get along with just about anybody except for Ares. And of course she's got the rivalry with Poseidon, but from aside that, I thought we could work together. I thought you might know something. I shook my head. I wished I could help her, but I felt too hungry and tired and mentally overworked to ask any more questions. I've got to get a quest, Annabeth muttered to herself. I'm not too young. If they would just tell me the problem. I could smell barbecue smoke coming from somewhere. Annabeth must have heard my stomach growl. She told me to go on. She'd catch me later. I left her on the pier, tracing her fingers across the rail as if drawing a battle pattern. Back at cabin 11, everybody was talking and horsing around waiting for dinner. For the first time, I noticed that a lot of the campers had similar features. Sharp noses, upturned eyebrows, mischievous smiles. They were the kind of kids the teachers would peg as troublemakers. Thankfully, nobody paid much attention to me as I walked over to my spot on the floor and plopped down with my minotaur horn. The counselor, Luke, came over. He had the Hermes family resemblance, too. It was marred by the scar on his right cheek, but his smile was intact. "I found you a sleeping bag," he said, "and I sold you some toiletries from the camp store." I couldn't tell if he was kidding about the stealing part. I said, "Thanks." "No prob." Luke sat next to me. He pushed his back against the wall. "Tough first day?" "I don't belong here," I said. "I don't even believe in gods." "Yeah," he said, "that's how we all started. Once you start believing them, it doesn't get any easier." The bitterness in his voice surprised me because Luke seemed like a pretty easygoing guy. He looked like he could handle just about anything. "So, your dad is Hermes," I said. He pulled a switchblade out of his back pocket, and for a second I thought he was going to gut me. But he just scraped the mud off the sole of his shoe. "Yeah, Hermes." "The, wing-footed messenger guy?" "That's him. Messengers, medicine, travelers, merchants, thieves, anyone who uses the roads. That's why you're here, enjoying Cabin 11's hospitality. Hermes isn't picky about who he sponsors." I figured Luke didn't mean to call me a nobody. He just had a lot on his mind. "You ever met your dad?" I asked. "Once." I waited, thinking that if he wanted to tell me, he'd tell me. Apparently he didn't. I wondered if the story had anything to do with how he got his scar. Luke looked up and managed a smile. "Don't worry about it, Percy. The campers here, they're mostly good people. After all, we are extended family, right? We take care of each other." He seemed to understand how lost I felt. And I was grateful for that, because an older guy like him, even if he was a counselor, should have steered clear of an uncool middle schooler like me. But Luke had welcomed me into the cabin. He even stole me some stuff, which was the nicest thing anybody's done for me all day. I decided to ask him my last big question, the one that'd been bothering me all day. Clarice from Ares was joking about me being Big 3 material. Then Annabeth said I might be the one. She said I should talk to the Oracle. What's that about? Luke folded his knife. "I hate prophecies." "What do you mean?" His face twitched around the scar. "Let's just say I messed things up for everybody else. The last 2 years, ever since my trip to the Garden of Hesperides went sour, Chiron hasn't allowed any more quests. Annabeth's been dying to get out into the world. She pestered Chiron so much, he finally told her he already knew her fate. He had a prophecy from the Oracle. He wouldn't tell her the whole thing, but he said Annabeth wasn't destined to go on a quest yet. She had to wait until somebody special came to camp." "Someone special?" "Don't worry about it, kid," Luke said. "Annabeth wants to think that every new camper who comes through here is the omen she's been waiting for. Now, come on, it's dinner time." The moment he said it, a horn blew in the distance. Somehow I knew it was a conch shell, even though I'd never really heard one before. Luke yelled, "11, fall in." The whole cabin, about 20 of us, filed into the commons yard. We lined up in order of seniority, so of course I was dead last. Campers came from other cabins too, except for the 3 empty cabins at the end. And cabin 8, which looked normal in the daytime, had now started to glow silver as the sun went down. We marched up the hill to the mess hall pavilion. Satyrs joined us from the meadows. Naiads emerged from the canoeing lake. A few other girls came out of the woods. And when I say out of the woods, I mean straight out of the woods. I saw one girl. about 9 or 10, melt from the side of a maple tree and come skipping up the hill. In all, there were maybe about a dozen campers, a few dozen satyrs, and a dozen assorted wood nymphs and naiads. At the pavilion, torches blazed around the marble columns. Central fire burned in a bronze brazier at the size of a bathtub. Each cabin had its own table, covered in white cloth trimmed in purple. 4 of the tables were empty, but cabin 11's was way overcrowded. I had to squeeze onto the edge of a bench with half my butt hanging off. I saw Grover sitting at table 12 with Mr. D, a few satyrs, and a couple of plump blonde boys who looked just like Mr. D. Chiron stood to the one side, a picnic table being way too small for a centaur. Anne of the set sat at table 6 with a bunch of serious-looking athletic kids, all with her gray eyes and honey blonde hair. Clarice sat behind me at the Aries table. She apparently gotten over being hosed down because she was laughing and belching right alongside her friends. Finally, Chiron pounded his hoof against the marble floor of the pavilion, and everybody fell silent. He raised a glass. To the gods! Everybody else raised their glasses. To the gods! Wood nymphs came forward with platters of food, grapes, apples, strawberries, cheese, fresh bread, and yes, barbecue. My glass was empty, but Luke said, "Speak to it, whatever you want." Non-alcoholic, of course. I said, "Cherry Coke." The glass filled with a sparkling caramel liquid. Then I had an idea. Blue Cherry Coke. The soda turned a violent shade of coblet. I took a cautious sip. Perfect. I drank a toast to my mother. She's not gone, I told myself. Not permanently. She's in the underworld, and if that's a real place, then someday... "Here you go, Percy," Luke said, handing me a platter of smoked brisket. I loaded my plate, and I was about to take a big bite when I noticed everybody getting up and carrying their plates towards the fire in the center of the pavilion. I wondered if they were going for dessert or something. "Come on," Luke told me. As I got closer, I saw everybody was taking a portion of their meal and dropping it into the fire. The ripest strawberry, the juiciest slice of beef, the warmest buttery roll. Luke murmured in my ear, "Burnt offerings for the gods. They like the smell." "You're kidding." His look warned me not to take this lightly, but I couldn't help wondering why an immortal, all-powerful being would like the smell of burning food. Luke approached the fire, bowed his head, and tossed a cluster of red grapes. "Hermes." I was next. I wished I knew what God's name to say. Finally, I made a silent plea. "Whoever you are, tell me, please." I scraped a big slice of brisket into the flames. When I caught a whiff of the smoke, I didn't gag. It smelled nothing like burning food. It smelled of hot chocolate and fresh baked brownies, hamburgers on the grill and wildflowers, and 100 of other things that shouldn't have gone well together, but it did. I could almost believe the gods could live off that smoke. When everybody returned to their seats and finished eating their meals, Chiron pounded his hoof for our attention. Mr. D got up with a huge sigh. "Yes, I suppose I better say hello to you brats." "Hello. Our activities director, Chiron, says the next capture the flag is Friday. Cabin 5 presently holds the laurels." A bunch of ugly cheering rose from the Aries table. "Personally, I couldn't care less, but congratulations. I should tell you we have a new camper today, Peter Johnson." Chiron mumbled something. "Percy Jackson," Mr. D corrected. "That's right, hurrah, all of that. Now run along to your silly campfire. Go on." Everybody cheered. We all headed down toward the amphitheater, where Apollo's cabin let us sing along. We sang songs about the gods, ate s'mores, and joked around. The funny thing was, I didn't feel like anybody was staring at me anymore. I felt like I was home. Later in the evening, when the sparks from the campfire were curling into the starry sky, the conch horn blew again, and we all filed back to the cabins. I didn't realize how exhausted I was until I collapsed on my borrowed sleeping bag. My fingers curled around the minotaur horn. I thought about my mom. But I had good thoughts. Her smile, the bedtime stories she would read to me when I was a kid. The way she told me not to let the bed bugs bite. When I closed my eyes, I fell asleep instantly. That was my first day at Camp Half-Blood. I wish I'd known how briefly I would get to enjoy my new home. That was the end of chapter 7, and that's all we're going to read for today.